Patton walked into the officers' mess hall at a liberated German POW camp in southern Bavaria, May of '45, and what he saw made his jaw lock so tight you could hear his teeth grinding from across the room. German officers, Kriegsmarine captains, Luftwaffe majors, sitting at white-clothed tables with American mess trays in front of them, forks in hand, eating hot food off regulation U.S. Army china. And through the window, in the mud outside, black soldiers from the 761st Tank Battalion stood in a chow line in the rain, holding their trays, waiting. Patton didn't say a word for 10 seconds. He just stood there. Then he turned to the American captain running the camp and said 6 words that emptied that room faster than an artillery barrage. The German officers kept eating. That was their first mistake. Here's the thing. This wasn't some rear echelon supply depot. This was a forward holding facility for high-value German POWs awaiting intelligence debriefs, and the 761st had just finished a 96-hour advance through enemy territory to secure the perimeter. They'd lost 11 men in the last 72 hours, and now they were standing outside in the rain because the camp commander, a captain from Ohio named Edward Milford, had decided that German officers raided indoor seating and the black tankers didn't. Patton found out about it because a sergeant from the 761st, a man named Isaiah Garrett from Detroit, mentioned it to a visiting correspondent who happened to be eating lunch with Patton's staff that afternoon. Patton didn't ask for clarification. He didn't send an aide. He got in his Jeep and drove there himself. Subscribe if you believe men who bled for this country shouldn't have been made to stand in the rain while the enemy ate indoors. Hit that subscribe button if you believe Patton was right to walk in there and burn that whole arrangement to the ground. Now look, the 761st Tank Battalion wasn't some footnote unit. They were Patton's own tank destroyers during the drive into Germany. He'd personally requested them. He'd stood in front of them in November of '44 and told them, quote, "I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." And they did. They punched through the Siegfried Line. They held ground at the Battle of the Bulge when entire white infantry divisions folded. Patton knew exactly who they were, and now one of his own captains had seated German POWs inside while Garrett and his men ate standing up in the mud. When Patton walked into that mess hall, he didn't raise his voice. That's what made it worse. He looked at Captain Milford and said, "Explain this to me." Milford started talking about capacity limits and POW officer protocol under Geneva. Patton let him finish. Then he asked him one question. "Are those men eating off my china?" What Milford didn't understand was that Patton had a thing about respect. Not the spit-shine parade ground kind. The kind that said if you wore the uniform and you'd seen combat, you sat down to eat. It didn't matter if you were a private or a colonel, white or black, American or allied. You sat, and if space was tight, the men who'd been shooting at you last week stood. That was the order. It was so obvious to Patton that he didn't think he needed to write it down. Apparently he was wrong. Milford tried to argue that the German officers outranked the American enlisted. Patton's face went blank. Not angry, blank. Like he was looking at something so stupid it didn't compute. He turned to the nearest MP and said, "Get these Germans outside. Now, all of them. They can finish their meal standing in the rain. And if any of them complain, you tell them General Patton said they're lucky they're eating it all." Here's where it gets ugly. The German officers didn't move. A Luftwaffe major, a guy named Erich Steinfeld, actually put his fork down, looked at Patton and said in English, "General, we are protected under international law." Patton stared at him for 5 seconds. Then he walked over to Steinfeld's table, picked up his tray with both hands, walked it to the door, and dumped the entire meal into the mud outside. He came back in, looked at Steinfeld, and said, "You want to file a complaint? You do it standing in the rain with the rest of the losers." Steinfeld's face went white. The other Germans got up. Patton stood there and watched every single one of them walk outside into the weather. Then he turned to Sergeant Garrett and the men from the 761st, who were still standing in the chow line, and said, "Inside. Now, hot food. Sit down. Picture the scene. 15 minutes later, the mess hall is full of black tankers sitting at tables, eating off plates that 10 minutes ago had German officers at them. And outside in the rain, 30 Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine POWs are standing with their trays, soaked, silent, watching through the windows. Patton sat down at a table with Garrett and 3 other sergeants and ate with them. Didn't say much, just ate. One of the men there, a corporal named James Whitley from Alabama, said later that Patton asked him where he was from, how long he'd been in combat, whether he had enough ammunition, normal stuff. But the whole time, Patton kept glancing at the Germans outside, and every time he did, his jaw tightened a little more. After the meal, Patton called Milford into a side room. Nobody knows exactly what was said, but Milford came out white as a sheet, and within 48 hours, he was reassigned to a logistics unit in France processing supply requisitions. He never commanded men again. Now here's the part that didn't make it into the official report. 3 days later, Patton got a letter from a German POW officer, not Steinfeld, but another one, a naval captain named Klaus Richter, who'd been in that mess hall. The letter was in English, typed on a manual typewriter, and it was addressed to General Patton, 3rd Army. In it, Richter complained formally about the treatment of German officers under American custody and cited specific articles of the Geneva Convention regarding the dignity of captured enemy combatants. He demanded an apology and a formal investigation into Patton's conduct. Patton read the letter. Then he wrote a reply. 1 sentence. You lost. Shut up! He signed it, had it delivered, and kept the carbon copy in his personal files. It's still there, archived. I'm not making this up. But stay with me, because what happened next is the part that separates this from just another Patton being Patton story. A week after the mess hall incident, Patton visited the 761st at their bivouac area near Coburg. He didn't announce it. He just showed up. He found Sergeant Garrett, pulled him aside, and asked him why he hadn't reported the mess hall situation up the chain of command earlier. Garrett said, "Sir, I didn't think it would matter." Patton stared at him. Then he said, "It matters to me." He told Garrett that any time one of his men got treated like that, Garrett was to send word directly to 3rd Army HQ, bypassing battalion and division if necessary. He gave Garrett a name, a major on his staff, and told him to use it. Then Patton did something nobody expected. He stood there in the rain with Garrett and asked him about Detroit, about what he did before the war, about his family. They talked for 20 minutes. When Patton left, Garrett said it felt like Patton was apologizing without saying the word. Let that sit with you. Patton, the man who slapped soldiers for shell shock, the man who told his troops to wade through enemy blood, took time out of running an army to apologize to a black sergeant for something a captain did. Not because it looked good, because it was right. Fast forward 3 weeks. The 761st is rotated out of the line for rest and refit. They're billeted in a small Bavarian town called Miesbach, and the local military government officer, an American lieutenant named Paul Decker, assigns them to barracks on the outskirts while white units get quarters in the town center. Same pattern. The men from the 761st don't say anything. They're used to it, but somebody tells Patton. This time he doesn't drive out himself. He sends a colonel from his staff, a man named Andrew Hargrove, with written orders. The orders are 2 lines long. Reassign billeting immediately. 761st gets priority placement. Any officer who objects will explain himself to me personally. Decker reassigns the quarters. The 761st moves into the center of town. Hargrove stays there for 2 days to make sure it sticks. When he reports back to Patton, Patton asks him one question. Did they get what they earned? Hargrove says yes. Patton nods, and that's the end of it. Here's what they don't put in the textbooks. Patton wasn't some civil rights crusader. He wasn't marching for integration. He didn't write letters to Congress about racial equality. What he had was a code. The code said you fight, you earn respect. You bleed, you sit at the table. You take ground, you get treated like a soldier. It didn't matter what color you were, it mattered what you did. And when that code got violated, Patton didn't file a report or wait for a committee. He walked into the room and fixed it himself. That's what made him different. Now jump ahead to June of '45. The war in Europe is over. The 761st is waiting for redeployment orders. Patton throws them a review ceremony, full honors. He stands in front of the entire battalion and tells them they were one of the best units he ever commanded. Then he says something that gets quoted in every history of the 761st, but nobody ever explains. He says, "You proved that a man's worth is measured by what he does under fire, not by the shape of his face or the color of his skin." And then he pauses. And he adds, "Some of my own officers forgot that. I made sure they remembered." He didn't name Milford. He didn't name Decker. But everyone there knew exactly who he meant. Think about that for a second. Patton, in front of hundreds of men, admitting that his own command structure screwed up and that he had to step in and fix it. That's not the Patton you see in the movies. That's the Patton who understood that respect isn't given, it's enforced. Cut to 1947. Patton's dead, killed in a car accident in December of '45. The 761st is deactivated. Sergeant Garrett is back in Detroit working at a Ford plant. And one day he gets a letter. It's from Patton's widow, Beatrice. She's going through her husband's personal effects, and she found a note in his files. The note is dated May 12, 1945, the day after the mess hall incident, and it's in Patton's handwriting. It says, "Visited POW camp today. Found German officers eating indoors while 761st ate outside. Fixed it. Milford reassigned. Will not tolerate this again." That's it. 4 sentences. But Beatrice thought Garrett should have it. She mailed it to him with a short note of her own that said, "My husband respected your service. I wanted you to know he remembered." Garrett framed it. It hung in his house in Detroit until he died in 1983. His daughter still has it. Here's what's hard to swallow. That mess hall incident? It wasn't isolated. It happened at camps all over the European theater in the spring of '45. Black soldiers, many of them combat veterans, getting assigned to the worst billets, the coldest barracks, the last spot in the chow line, while German POWs got better treatment because some American officers couldn't let go of the idea that a white enemy deserved more respect than a black ally. Patton wasn't the only general who saw it, but he was one of the few who walked in and stopped it on the spot. Most of the others wrote memos. Patton grabbed trays and threw food in the mud. And this is where the story turns. Because what Patton did in that mess hall wasn't just about one meal. It was about the message. The message to Milford and every other officer like him: you don't get to dishonor men who fought for you. The message to the 761st: you earned this, and I'm going to make sure you get it. The message to the Germans: you lost, and that means you eat last. Patton didn't say any of this out loud. He just did it, and that's why the men who were there never forgot it. 2 months later, the war's over and the reckoning's starting. Nuremberg trials, war crime investigations, SS officers getting pulled out of POW camps and sent to cells. And buried in the trial prep documents, there's a deposition from Klaus Richter, the naval captain who wrote Patton the complaint letter. In it, Richter admits that German POWs were treated better than many black American soldiers in the initial months after surrender, and that certain American officers seemed more comfortable dining with us than with their own men. The prosecutor asks him to elaborate. Richter refuses, but the admission is there, documented, and I mean documented. So here's the loop. The 50 American dog tags I opened with? That was a different story, but the chain Patton saw in that mess hall was just as real. It was the chain of command, the one that said some men mattered more than others, and Patton snapped it. He didn't file paperwork. He didn't wait for approval. He walked in, looked at what was wrong, and fixed it with his hands. Sergeant Garrett said later that he'd served under a dozen officers, white and black, and Patton was the only one who made him feel like the uniform meant the same thing on everyone who wore it. Garrett lived to be 79. He never stopped telling that story. And every time he told it, he ended the same way. Patton made them stand in the rain, and he sat down and ate with us. That's all you need to know about the man. I know what you just heard isn't easy to sit with. It's uncomfortable because it reminds us that some of the ugliest fights weren't against the enemy. They were inside our own ranks. Hit subscribe if you believe stories like this need to stay loud while we still have time to learn from them. Hit like so this reaches the people who need to hear it. And if someone in your family served, drop their name in the comments. Let's say it out loud right here. There are stories that don't fit in one video, and the next one involves something Patton found in a German officer's house that made him refuse to file an official report. You're not ready for it.